But I do think we should be able to actually interrogate the substance of Nigel Farage's claim without it necessarily suggesting we're on the side of Vladimir Putin, or indeed that NATO should, or Western governments shouldn't be supporting.
It's not you're in favour of road pricing, it's that you're against road communism.
And so to me, the reason that Reform is doing so well and the Tories are doing so badly in the UK is actually just that the Conservative government has basically failed to deliver on so many of their promises. Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast. With me, Tom Clougherty, my co-host, Matthew Lesh, and joining us on the podcast this week, the IEA's managing editor, Daniel Freeman. Our goal is to bring you a public affairs podcast with a difference. We want to go beyond the headlines and the shallow political commentary you'll get elsewhere, and instead dig into the big ideas and underlying principles that classical liberals care about. This week, we're going to be discussing whether neoliberalism leads to populism, whether road pricing is inevitable or indeed desirable. But first, we're going to talk about Nigel Farage's controversial comments about Ukraine.
Well, of course, Tom, Nigel Farage has sparked some quite significant controversy this week by suggesting that NATO and EU expansion helped provoke actions in Moscow that led to the Ukraine war. Now, Farage has insisted as well in those comments that he ultimately blamed Putin, but nevertheless, this idea of it somehow being the responsibility of the West has sparked really strong condemnation from the likes of Rishi Sunak, from opposition leader Keir Starmer, with many accusations that he's an appeaser. Now, Daniel, before we kind of go into, I suppose, a broader discussion about how maybe as classical liberals we should think about foreign policy, I'm interested as someone who has spent some time in Russia as well as Ukraine and studies this part of the world quite closely. What did you make of Farage's comments?
I, in some ways, actually found not so much the comments, but the reactions to them quite encouraging in various ways. Because it's a comment that's often been sort of doing the rounds in journalists in Ukraine who hear from sort of Ukrainian officials that Britain is the only country where we don't need to worry about who wins the election. And I think that's still largely true. So Farage's comments are basically in the context of comments he previously made in 2014, where he criticised EU expansion into the Baltic states and NATO expansion into them roughly the same time. Now, what's interesting about what he said is that he was essentially focusing on this historical question of like, how significant was NATO expansion in Putin's decision to go to war? But what he wasn't disputing was whether the West should provide arms to NATO, which is something that is a kind of big issue in the United States. Whereas it's just not here.
I think it's a bit of a risk here that Farage has maybe broken a taboo. So if your view is that we shouldn't be effectively victim blaming Ukraine for the fact that the madman empire building Putin decided to send invading forces, you've kind of opened up a set of public opinion that may have already existed. I suspect there already was a set of public opinion on the right who maybe are slightly more following the American kind of isolationist, conservative, NatCon kind of...
Well, I think you've striken something quite accurate. Something that's actually quite true there. But I don't think it'll do Farage many favours in that I think this is largely a product of him spending a bit too much time in America. So when you look at polling and surveys from the US, there is a substantial portion of US Republican voters who are very sceptical about NATO and to some extent sympathetic to Putin. Now, YouGov has done some surveys really quite recently on British attitude to NATO, and the thing is, that just doesn't exist here in the same way. So, if you look at like support for NATO overall, is it a good thing? You find 80% of the public think NATO is a good thing.
We really get to put its interest for people to think that NATO is a bad thing, because it's effectively asking, a statement on America now.
Well, that's true, but it also extends into questions about NATO expansion.
Yes.
So when you ask, should NATO expand to other European countries that it doesn't already cover, this is leaving aside, Poland, the Baltic states, that sort of thing. 76% of the public think they approve that. 80% of the public think that Ukraine should join NATO. In fact, basically, if you ask the public about any European country joining NATO, basically you get pretty consistent majorities in favour. And so the number of people who buy this line that, the war was really caused by NATO rather than Putin, Putin and his attitudes to, the Ukrainian state, which is basically, if you read his writings, if you listen to some of the speeches he's made since the start of the war, it's very clear that basically the issue is that he doesn't see Ukraine as a proper nation state.
Yeah.
And therefore, Russia has been, Finland has just joined NATO, and there was very little criticism from Russia on that because he does not conceive of Finland as being a part of Russia's sphere of influence.
I mean, this is the intriguing moment, of course, wasn't it, Tom, when Tucker Carlson had interviewed Putin, and I spent far too much time watching that video, but basically Tucker opens with a question, giving him the opportunity to complain about NATO expansion, and he immediately goes into this historic view of events that basically says Ukraine is just part of Russia.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I respond slightly differently to the furore that Nigel Farage's comments have generated, and without particularly taking a position one way or another on what he said, our response, but the kind of the media response and the political response, I actually find a little bit worrying. And it made me think about an IEA dinner I attended about 100 years ago, and people involved will remain nameless. But someone who was giving a speech said, basically, I know some people are against the Iraq war, but at the end of the day, you're either with the terrorists or you're against them, and tried to reduce it down to that black and white thing. And this is not quite so extreme as that, but I do find it worrying where any kind of criticism of Western policy is immediately kind of shamed as being, you're on the side of the enemy, you're obviously a stooge for Putin. Now, I also have a kind of countervailing concern to that, which I kind of think back over my career in the libertarian movement. There was a weird period of time where libertarians were constantly being invited on Russia Today to give very kind of libertarian talking points.
Which we use as kind of as isolationist view. And in fact, that there were a lot
isolationist, but also often just attacking their own governments as being authoritarian in some way or socialist in some way. And, I never took those media bids because I always thought basically, libertarians are being used by some bit of the Russian state here as useful idiots to try and kind of delegitimize Western governments and allow people like Putin to kind of create this impression, well, we're all the same. And they're as bad as I am. Now, that's wrong too, but I do think we should be able to actually interrogate the substance of Nigel Farage's claim without it necessarily suggesting we're on the side of Vladimir Putin, or indeed that NATO should, or Western governments shouldn't be supporting.
Let's just for a second maybe step back and think about the kind of libertarian, and maybe it's distinctive from a kind of a classic liberal approach to international relations, because something that does certainly exist on the American libertarian right is a very isolationist set of thoughts who were very critical of the Iraq war, who were very critical of American kind of, I suppose, internationalism, who indeed some of their writing prior to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia were probably more sympathetic to the Russian side and would in fact themselves make this argument. I'm wondering how we think about that compared to Britain, where typically on the kind of classical liberal market side of things has been very overlapping with, I suppose, maybe a more neoliberal worldview, a more kind of internationalist, perhaps even accepting some level of interventionist foreign policy. I want to hear, I suppose, Tom, how you think about that, where the IEA stands now. Now, we did a publication recently on a classical liberal approach to foreign policy, which I think is distinctive from the libertarian approach. It was a little bit more interventionist, but still realist in its disposition. What are kind of structurally, how should we think about these sort of issues and maybe Britain's role in the world?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, it is a lot easier to be isolationist in America, just geographically. In a sense, we're a lot closer to the action, wherever it happens to be. In all likelihood, it's going to be a lot closer to home for us. And this is a European ground war that's a significant thing, potentially a significant thing for Britain, although even historically we've had isolationist movements in Britain as well. I mean, as to the question of whether there is a classical liberal or a libertarian view of foreign policy, I mean, I know some people here, Steve Davies, for example, I think would argue that there just isn't a libertarian view or a classical liberal view of foreign policy. And this is something that we have widespread disagreements on, and so it's hard to tease out a kind of coherent position. Personally, I've always erred on the non-interventionist side, or the realist or non-interventionist or pacificist side, however you want to frame it. I think actually a lot of the same criticisms that apply to domestic government interventions can be applied to foreign ones as well. And this is probably kind of a silly example, but if you say, as a classical liberal, the government cannot fix the school system, they have the wrong incentives, they lack the information to do it, a market will outperform them massively, governments, inherently fail in these areas. But then you say, well, we can probably invade another country, get rid of their government, install a new one, and fix it. Now, maybe there's sometimes a case for that, but I also think it seems like a logical error.
But I think this is a slightly different question. The question about, is liberal interventionism justified? And I think you're absolutely right that a lot of libertarians, particularly, and a lot of people more broadly, in the Western world kind of got their fingers burned over the Iraq War, where you had this quite sort of idealized notion that you could go into another country and sort of, install democracy and everything would be fine. That turned out not to work very well. But I think the people are applying those lessons in an inaccurate way to Ukraine. Because this, in Ukraine, it is not a matter of trying to install a preferred government. It is trying to help a nation state not be conquered.
Yeah.
And I think that is a much more straightforward proposition. You don't have to believe that Ukraine is a perfect country or a perfect liberal democracy in every way. It's not. You just have to believe that nations do have the right to defend themselves against being conquered.
I suppose the question is there a kind of collective interest in a way of trying to, from a classical liberal perspective, of developing a global system in which I suppose as many countries as possible are liberal in the liberal kind of bloc, a liberal, classical liberal, Western bloc, who generally speaking respect human rights, respect free and open trade and play by the same rules. And therefore there's some justification, there's some interest for trying to intervene. I mean, I've always had, sympathies for the Christopher Hitchens view of the Iraq War, which is that, okay, it was obviously a disaster in many ways, and they underestimated the difficulty, as you rightfully say. There are rare cases that it did happen in Japan, it did happen in Germany, but it's really hard to come into a country, remove a regime, and build a new government. But on the other hand, removing Saddam Hussein is like a very strong moral good to me, and kind of you can overlearn as I think you're getting at, you can overlearn the lesson from Iraq that we should withdraw from the world, and when you withdraw from the world, it potentially creates more danger, including for us here in the UK.
I would also say there's a useful principle, like aside from liberal democracy. I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine would be illegitimate and deserve it would be perfectly legitimate for the Ukrainians to exist, even if Ukraine were not a liberal democracy. I think it's a good principle for the world in general to have the idea that you shouldn't invade your neighbors and try to annex their territory, and if you do that, it should be really expensive. So I kind of think of it in some ways like that that line about 18th century British criminal justice, where they say, we don't hang men for stealing horses, we hang them that horses might not be stolen. And so I think it's, even if you say, as some, libertarians do say, that why should we care about Ukraine? It's not our concern. Well, even if you don't care about Ukraine, it's still useful that, other countries, China, know that if you do, start engaging in territorial expansion and aggrandizement, it's going to cost you.
All right, well, let's. I think we could probably stick on that topic for a while. There are many other things to be said, but let's move on to the next one, which is change of pace to road pricing. Now, I suppose the impetus for including this on the podcast this week, and it's kind of a perennial topic, but Paul Johnson, the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, when they were talking about the political parties' manifestos recently, he was bemoaning the conspiracy of silence over the state of the public finances, suggesting that without changes on things like debt interest and healthcare and defence expenditure, probably whoever wins the election coming up next week would be raising taxes. And so they went on to talk a little bit about the ways that you might raise tax. One of the things he brought up was road pricing. And he highlighted the fact that at the moment we get about 30 billion a year from fuel duty. But that is going to dwindle to approximately nothing over the coming decades as people switch to electric vehicles. So that's obviously a fiscal hole. And his suggestion was we need to look, again, at road pricing as a way of plugging that fiscal hole. I think there are good reasons to look at road pricing, even leaving aside the fiscal question. And this is a topic that's been on the agenda for a really long time. The famous Smead report was in 1962. I dug out of the IEA archive earlier a self-financing road system by Gabriel Roth, which was written in 1966. So this was the first time we published about road pricing. And of course, you had the Eddington Review, I think, in the mid-2000s. Tony Blair's Labour government made a concerted effort, at least, to get the idea of national road pricing going. And then it's slipped off the agenda, although you've had things like the congestion charge in London, congestion charging in a few other cities. You've had the ultra-low emissions zone, which has caused significant controversy in recent years. You've had certain other traffic interventions. You also had the Conservatives in their general election manifesto just ruling out road pricing, saying, we will not introduce road pricing. No one was suggesting it, actually, apart from the IFS and a few other think tanks. But I think road pricing is a fundamentally good idea whose time maybe is coming. And I know this is a very unusual thing for anybody to say, but I'm sort of passionately in favour of road pricing. And it's been one of the ideas that I've been really excited about for a long time. I noticed that face, Daniel, that I've been excited about for a long time. And, fundamentally it comes down to this, I think. Road space is scarce. It's a scarce resource, especially at busy times. We all know, this is basic economics, there are different ways that you can apportion scarce resources. You can have people queue up, or you can allocate them by price. And at the moment, we have a system where we force people to queue up. That's called congestion, and it has huge negative externalities in terms of lost economic output, in terms of nuisance and frustration, in terms of environmental damage, and so on, the kind of ruination of many cities. On the other hand, you have pricing. And we are very easily technologically advanced enough now to introduce a seamless system of road pricing, which would basically, I think, raise prices at busy times on busy streets, discourage people from driving then, encourage them to use alternatives or to shift their schedules. You could probably have pretty much guaranteed journey times if you implemented pricing in a very pure, economically driven way. One of the underappreciated side benefits of this, actually, is that you could run reliable, cost-effective bus services that, people could feel sure that they could take a bus and they could get from A to B in a reliable and speedy fashion. Maybe the road pricing would provide the revenue to run those alternatives for people who otherwise maybe couldn't afford the charges. The big challenge is one of political economy here, right? Every time road pricing comes onto the agenda, whoever is the other side will be massively against it. So had the Tories proposed it, you could guarantee that Labour would massively go against it. And the opposite would be true as well. So I wonder, first of all, guys, do you share my enthusiasm for road pricing? Do you think it's something that's coming? But also, do you think that those political economy constraints are solvable?
Well, I'm also fairly sympathetic to the arguments for road pricing. And there's a previous IEA podcast where I and Andy Meyer get into a debate over rolling out ULEZ, because I'm basically fine with that as well as a sensible way of rationing a scarce commodity and dealing with negative externalities as well. One way you can phrase this is it's not you're in favour of road pricing, it's that you're against road communism. which is what we currently have. We have a scarce commodity that is provided free at the point of use, and therefore what do you get? Well, you don't pay for it in price in the straightforward way. You pay for it by queuing. And that is particularly notable in some of our big cities. So even in London, which does have a congestion charge, you still have some of the sort of slowest moving traffic out of any major city in Europe. And that's basically because we don't charge enough for it, and there are far too many exemptions.
So let me say, the IEA is where you can come both for excitement about war in Ukraine as well as road pricing. The place where every niche you can get.
Yeah.
I mean, there was thinking about kind of the way we currently price road usage is through very high petrol excise taxes that more than cover more than cover the negative externalities as well as the maintenance costs of using roads. Because if you look at how much is spent on maintenance, it's way less than is picked
it's about half, I think.
Yeah. And recently it turned out the Green Party came up with actually a very IEA policy idea recently, which is that they wanted to introduce an economy-wide carbon tax and replace the likes of petrol excise with that. What I don't think the Green Party realizes that would actually mean a significant decrease in the excise, because the excise is currently significantly higher than would be necessary to deal with the externality cost of carbon. I think at a principle level, it would make a lot of sense to have road pricing. I can entirely agree with you. I've written things in favor of road pricing. It is a way and is becoming more popular within, I suppose, policy circles as well as within government, civil service and Treasury are getting really interested in it for the reason you've said, that they're worried about that lost revenue. What I do wonder about, though, is it actually something that could ever be politically viable? I'm not convinced it is, because and there's effectively like a distributional issue where at the moment you don't really see how much you're paying in petrol excise, but you will start to see it, how much road pricing you're paying. Then there'll be questions and concerns about, well, there are poorer drivers being hit by a tax. Now we can say that won't be factually true, but drivers, despite like the perception people have when they live in London, most people in the UK get to work, get to school, go about their day using a car. Something like, I think 60 or 70% of journeys are by car. And the perception that the government is anti-car, which would come out of trying to reduce a road pricing system, I think would be so toxic that, and for the reason you've said, the opposition, in this case, likely to be the Conservatives who've already ruled it out, are basically setting themselves up to try to oppose something Labour does. Now, in a sense, I hope from a policy perspective, Labour could overcome that. I just don't know whether they're going to be willing to have the fight. And then the other thing as well is, I don't know if they're going to be good enough at making the argument we're making about congestion and the cost of congestion. I don't know whether they're thinking in that way. I think they'll just want to do it for like revenue maximization reasons, and it could go down like an absolute lead balloon if mishandled.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And before I came to the IEA, when I was working at the Centre for Policy Studies, we did a report on road pricing, basically. And I went into that project very gung-ho and thinking, what we need to recommend is a sort of big bang where you introduce nationwide road pricing, make it comprehensive, and you scrap fuel duty at the same time. It's everywhere all at once, and it's this sort of economically pure, technologically advanced system. And what my co-author persuaded me of, and he actually did most of the work on this report, I have to say, was that would almost certainly run into the kind of trap, Matthew, that you're talking about, that you would just get this massive blob of opposition that would be very difficult politically to overcome, and that a much better approach would be to kind of come up with crafty ways to phase it in over time. So, for example, should you introduce it maybe at a low level for electric vehicles? And then as the market share of electric vehicles rises, road pricing becomes more and more the norm. People get used to it. They see that it's not so horrible. And then maybe you can switch other people over later. I mean, should you, rather than going for a nationwide approach, congestion is very much a local problem. It's targeted in a few big cities, maybe in smaller towns at very particular times of day, maybe on busy motorways and stuff. Should you focus on kind of local schemes like the London congestion charge, but more technologically advanced, smarter, so it's not just kind of a cordon price where you pay whatever it is for one day and you can drive around as much as you want, but you're paying according to the road use.
It would also be good if it was a congestion charge, because in London it's not really anymore now that it's 24/7.
Right.
Originally it was a daytime charge.
That's a good point. It's just it's a fee for driving,
it's now
so
just
it looks anti-car.
Yeah.
Right. And I think the other crucial thing that you have to try and get across is that if you're in provincial England, or for that matter, Scotland or Wales, a proper system of road pricing would mean you were paying far less to drive your car. Now, there's no getting around the fact, I think, that in London, you should be being charged. You should be paying more to drive.
Yeah, it's a more scarce.
Yeah, the value of road space in London
as well.
is much higher, and it's more polluting and everything else. But most drivers, most of the people who are regular car users, this would actually benefit them. And this is one of those horrible challenges of politics. In a way, you need an elite bargain. You need people to agree, this is a good idea, and we're going to agree basically not to attack each other over it. I mean, you could say the same thing about the planning system, though. We see the kind of progress we've made there.
Yeah. I mean, that did sort of happen with HS2 back in 2009 when it was first proposed, but
Right.
it
collapsed.
Yeah, it collapsed for different reasons, I suppose.
Well, hopefully there'll be more progress on this front than perhaps some of our most pessimistic views.
We should move to our final topic, Matthew.
So once again, populism is on the rise across the European Union and, of course, here in the UK, if considering the Reform UK's emergence was a major player in this campaign. And I suppose it's, again, kind of raising this question, which we've been debating more or less on and off since 2016, about what has been driving the tendency to vote into these right populist parties. This week, Janan Ganesh, who's a FT Financial Times columnist, wrote a quite provocative piece making the argument that, in fact, right-wing populism is not driven by neoliberalism. And in fact, if you look at the rise in Germany, Austria, France, Italy, all sorts of different economies, there's no clear link between economic policies and populist anger. And in tandem with that, he made an argument that pursuing status policies under the presumption that they're going to solve populism, so, for example, Biden's industrial strategy or likely Keir Starmer and even Tory levelling up strategy through government spending is not necessarily going to resolve the issue. Tom, what did you make of this?
Yeah, I mean, I thought he made an extremely strong case, and obviously I agree with it. But I think nonetheless, when you look at the kind of evidence he provides, I mean, it seems obvious almost, right? I mean, the country that already has a populist government, Italy, a country which very well could have a populist government, or at least a populist prime minister very soon, France. Neither of these are particularly neoliberal in their orientation. I'm not sure that Hungary ever was particularly a country you would describe as neoliberal either. I probably know less about that one. I think one of the really interesting things that he mentioned in that piece actually was it doesn't even seem to be connected to the decline of manufacturing, which is often the story you hear in Britain and in America, that the loss of these kind of classic blue-collar jobs that gave the communities a sense of vibrancy and life, a sense of meaning and everything. It doesn't even seem to be connected to that, because Germany's got the AfD doing extremely well, and their manufacturing share of the economy is just as high as it was.
This was the China shock, the classic paper that suggested that places that were very exposed to China shock had a real meaningful kind of reduction in employment in the US. And you could then say, well, that correlated with populist voting, but is correlation causation here? I suppose the question is, are there other factors at play?
I think it is pretty clear that immigration, and particularly the sense that immigration is out of control, is something that gives rise to populism. But I think that actually is one example of a broader theme that I would put populism down to, which is actually just the chronic failure of government and its apparent inability to respond to genuine democratic impulses. And so to me, the reason that Reform is doing so well and the Tories are doing so badly in the UK is actually just that the Conservative government has basically failed to deliver on so many of their promises. And what's more, it seems impossible that they would deliver on their promises. Yeah. Like they can't get a grip of government, even though they are the government. And that's where I think the strong man, the populist, comes in.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And yeah, when you look at the rise of populism across Europe in particular, it is pretty closely correlated with relatively high rates of immigration, historically speaking. And yeah, in the UK case, you did have this approach by the Conservatives of basically not going out to bat in favour of really, really high levels of immigration, not making the case in favour of it, but instead sort of saying, oh, yes, it's awful, we're trying to get it down, and then basically liberalising the system to actually increase the number of people coming. And that just really hasn't worked from an electoral perspective.
So one of the more interesting moments I experienced when I was first moved over to the UK in late 2016 or early 2017 was this kind of LSE government conference that descended into this quite aggressive arguments between some academics about what had led to populism. And there was someone very much representing that left-wing view. And the narrative sounds persuasive at first, which is deindustrialization because of neoliberal policies. And that they, at first look, at first sight, they seem to be the places that are, the red wall seems to be voting that way. And the problem is, of course, that when you start doing kind of deeper social science research, it never really added up. And perhaps the best example of this was Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart, who were kind of key figures involved in the World Values Survey, who look at this on really a cross-country basis. And they wrote a book, and more or less, I think this debate is over in the academics, serious political science academic circles don't really have this debate anymore. And they wrote this book called Cultural Backlash, and you notice it wasn't economic backlash. And their effective thesis was, backed up by a lot of public opinion data, is that more or less you had this era of very kind of culturally progressive politics really transformed the West through kind of the 60s, 70s into the 80s. And we're really seeing the fruits of that today. We have far more liberal attitudes to things like the role of the nation state and to race and gender and sex and all those kind of issues. What you see in kind of a popular sense, and I'd actually expand this out, I wouldn't say it's just about like government incompetence and it's not even just about immigration. It's really this thing around like identity and purpose of the nation, and that sense in which people feel like the kind of populism is driven by a sense in which you have kind of a progressive left force attacking their identity, their sense of like meaning and purpose in the world. And as a result of that leads them to drive towards those populist parties. Now, immigration is one part of that, but I think there are other kind of policy changes that there's a backlash here. And more or less in the kind of cultural backlash thesis, they didn't see a big correlation between people's incomes, which you would expect to see if that's the reason why people are voting for these populist parties.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've certainly seen, the US has actually had fairly strong income growth over the last 15 years. And it in 2016, you did have basically a populist, populist came to power. And whereas in Europe, where you've had a sort of pretty stagnant wage growth, it seems to have taken longer for this to sort of filter through, and it seems to vary quite a lot by country.
Yeah. I mean, I think one way, in fairness, to resolve this, of course, is if government is more competent and more focused on economics.
Easier said than done.
Well, indeed. I mean, it doesn't help the Tories that, in the case of immigration, even if you are pretty liberal leaning on immigration, that they have effectively lied again about their capacity to get down immigration, as you've already said there. But also, I think if the quality of life were improving or if public services were a bit better, there wouldn't be necessarily as much frustration with the Tories that then leads them to vote reform. I think that's kind of like an argument you can make around the economics, that maybe if we were more prosperous, there'd be less of this. But I really think in either case, this is not a new phenomenon. France had Le Pen get to the final two was in 2003. Australia had the Pauline Hanson in the late 90s as a kind of an earlier populist backlash. And you see, in Australian case, you see a lot of kind of rise in populism when you get discussions about immigration and these identity issues that then leads people to move away from that. So it's really questionable how much anything you do in economics is going to be able to solve those cultural issues.
I mean, I guess the question here is this just another sort of one-off? Is this sort of a spasm which will happen and then go away again? Or is it part of that bigger realignment that our colleague Steve Davies talks about in politics, of politics basically realigning around cultural polarities rather than being aligned around economics? So the big things become kind of cosmopolitanism and progressive attitudes versus a kind of sense of national identity and cultural conservatism and stuff on the other hand, and economics kind of fades away into the background. I mean, I think that's very plausible, and Steve has sort of been proved right in his predictions over the last few years to quite a worrying degree from my perspective. But I also do wonder whether, in a sense, there's a kind of decadence in that culture war politics, of politics being aligned around or polarized around cultural issues that basically stemmed from an era in which economics had kind of faded into the background and that things were kind of going okay. And all the different parties had more or less the same policies on economics, just with a little bit of difference here and there. But if we're in an era where basically our economic problems are going to become more and more difficult to deal with, does that suggest that actually we may repolarize around economic issues again? Or am I getting this completely wrong?
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I'm not sure how well it really works in, say, Britain, because we have, over the last 15 years, had a relative rise in, UK, Reform UK. But we haven't, that clearly isn't in our case, because we've been living in a great period where all our economic problems have been solved and we don't have anything to argue about left. I think basically you don't need to overthink it. It's basically there's quite a lot of immigration. Mainstream parties have repeatedly said, we are going to cut this, and then do the opposite, and you get a reaction to that.
And people. I mean, I was talking on behalf of the IEA to a kind of conservative group in London recently, and the first thing they talk about is the fact that they just feel like their communities change as a result of immigration. And in the first instance, there is a temptation, I think, just to label that as just pure racism. But people do, whether you like or not politically, just have a sense in which the world is not what it once was, and that's kind of almost feels like a threat to their identity and their sense of community, and they see things they don't like out of that. Just following up on the kind of Steve Davies thesis, I think he's right that indeed we do have this kind of new electoral cleavage that is complicating the dynamics and leading to some kind of realignment. I wouldn't say economics is over as a cleavage as well. I mean, I think it's complicated. It's just really complicated now that you have so many more dynamics, and you add on top of that the fact that party identity has really gone down. So people more or less historically were, there would be 30% of people who vote Labour at every election, 30% of people who vote Tory, 25%, whatever specifically it was at each election. But you had a really, really kind of strong base for each party. And now that's all gone because people don't identify the parties in the same way, because they don't necessarily, because the parties are trying to deal with the fact that they're working across different cleavages from an electoral perspective. So therefore you get what we're getting in this election, which is quite extreme results, because there's no base left. And you saw this in 2019, and then the commentary was, well, it's going to be Boris Johnson for the next 20 years. And you can just see how quickly these things can change depending on current dynamics, because people honestly aren't really that happy with anyone, and then it's like anyone's representing them that well. So therefore they're more open to alternatives, they're more open to swapping their vote, to lending their vote, as is the phrase sometimes used. I don't think it really is lending their vote. It's not like their vote has any ownership in the first place, and they're just willing to park it at each election wherever they feel it's best. This election, for a lot of people, that's no longer the Tories, but there's no reason it wouldn't be in future as opposed to Reform if they felt like the Tories were representing their interests. Nothing is kind of inevitable in this game.
Well, I feel like we're going to talk about some of those issues a lot more, maybe on the podcast next week, which I think we will record after the election results here in the UK come through. Those of you watching on YouTube may have noticed it's a very hot afternoon in the IEA studio. So we'll call things to a close there before the three of us melt. But I hope you've enjoyed our discussion this week. There is a wealth of information about these topics and many others at iea.org.uk. I'd encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel or whichever podcast service you're hearing this on. And indeed, sign up for our weekly newsletter and much more on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. But for now, until next time, thank you for listening.